Welcome back to our weekly Bible study here at Shepherd of the Prairie Lutheran Church in Huntley, Illinois. I'm Bill Waxenberg, the teaching pastor here at Shepherd of the Prairie, and if you've been with us before, it's great to have you back. If this is your first time, we are delighted that you are with us. We are preparing ourselves for Holy Week. This coming Sunday is Palm Sunday, or sometimes called the Sunday of the Passion. And we're going to be hearing part of the Passion narrative, part of the suffering and death, that story, the suffering and death of Jesus. And we're going to be turning to Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 49. It's time for us to prepare for Sunday. Pastor Mark is taking this text, and he is doing his preparation to preach the sermon, to give us God's good word. And it's our responsibility to also prepare, to look at the text, to open the text, to study the text, and to prepare ourselves in our hearts and our minds to hear what it is that God will have to say to us on Sunday morning, the Sunday of the Passion, through Pastor Mark's voice. So as we begin to prepare, let's join together for a word of prayer. Lord Jesus, you have much to say to us, and your story rebounds in our lives over and over again. It is a story that shapes who we are, it shapes our faith, and it shapes our lives. So as we open this part of your story from Luke 23, may the power of your Spirit be with us, opening us, empowering us, strengthening us, and helping us to see and hear what we need to see and hear. In your holy name we pray. Amen. I want to invite you to turn to the 23rd chapter of Luke's Gospel, and we're going to start out by reading verses 1 through 5. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against him." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to this place." Now the story of the Passion, the suffering and death of Jesus, actually doesn't begin here. It begins back in chapter 22. But Pastor Mark has chosen just a portion of this long story to use on Sunday morning. And so we begin here with the assembly bringing Jesus to Pilate. Now the assembly was made up of elders who were the wise men, made up of the scribes who were the legal beagles, and made up of the chief priests. They bring Jesus to Pilate, and they charge him with three different things. First of all, they say that Jesus was perverting the nation. Secondly, that he was forbidding payment of taxes. And thirdly, that he was claiming to be the Messiah or the King. All of those charges are spurious. None of them are true. Jesus was not perverting the nation, and we don't really know exactly what that means. But if they think that Jesus was perverting the nation by telling people not to pay taxes, that's not true either. As a matter of fact, back in chapter 20, when he's asked about payment of taxes, Jesus says, you will remember, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And lastly, the charge against Jesus claiming to be the Messiah is totally untrue. Jesus never made that claim. In fact, he was very careful not to make that claim until after the crucifixion and the resurrection. Pilate asks him the question, "So, are you king?" And Jesus' response is really a non-answer. "You say so." Jesus doesn't say yes, and Jesus doesn't say no. And therefore, Pilate renders him not guilty. I find no guilt with this man. But then, the assembly that's brought Jesus there claims that Jesus has been causing trouble from the time that he was in Galilee until he came south into Judea. And when Pilate hears those words, he feels like he's off the hook, because Galilee is under Herod's jurisdiction, not Pilate's. And so Pilate sends Jesus to Herod. And we read about that in verses 6 through 12. When Pilate heard this, he asked whether this man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who himself was in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform signs. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. And then Herod put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other before they had been enemies. So Jesus is sent to Herod because Galilee is under Herod's jurisdiction. And Herod has been wanting to see Jesus. He's heard stories about him, probably heard that he's performed miracles, and he wants to see him do some tricks. This reminds me of Jesus Christ Superstar, and maybe you remember that play back in the 1970s. There's a song in there in which Herod sings, "Jesus, walk across my swimming pool. Walk on the water. Let me see you do something special. Do a trick for me." And just like Pilate, Herod asks Jesus questions, and again, Jesus provides absolutely no answers. The religious leaders mock Jesus, they accuse Jesus, a robe is put on Jesus, and he's returned back to Pilate. And we are told that from that day forward, they become very close friends. Then, beginning in verse 13, Jesus is sentenced to death. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence, and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither is Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." And then they all shouted together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us." This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again. But they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified. And their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished. So Pilate once again addresses the people, finding no guilt in Jesus. Even Herod didn't find any guilt. There's no reason for him to be put to death. The people respond by giving us Barabbas. Give us Barabbas, who we are told was in prison for insurrection and for murder. It's interesting that in Luke's interpretation of this story, that Pontius Pilate desires to release Jesus not once, but 3 different times. Pilate finally gives in, not because he's convinced that Jesus has done anything worthy of death, but rather because the crowd demands it. In Luke's understanding, Pilate is pretty much off the hook. And later on in the Acts of the Apostles, which is Luke's 2nd volume, it becomes pretty clear that the blame for Jesus' death rests upon the Jews. There are sermons by Peter and by Paul and by Stephen that accuse the Jewish people of killing Jesus. This is a warning to us. This is a very, very dangerous attitude, and we need to be very, very careful with it. This kind of biblical statement is in danger of leading us into anti-Semitism, which is making a rise again today. It would be much better for us when we read these passages not to read it as the Jewish people are guilty of killing Jesus, but rather that the Jewish leaders bear responsibility for his death. There's been a tendency for the last 2,000 years for the church in one way or another to blame the Jewish people as a whole or to blame the nation. And this kind of anti-Semitism has led to some real tragedies. In fact, we as Lutherans have to own up to that. Martin Luther, towards the very end of his life, wrote some very, very hateful things about the Jews. And the problem with that is that once you put things in writing, it carries on from generation to generation. And as a result of Luther's writings, Adolf Hitler during the 1930s and 1940s used even Luther's writings to justify his own hate for the Jewish people. A number of years ago, the Lutheran Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, owned up to what Luther wrote and rejected what Luther wrote and offered an apology to the Jewish community. That's a very, very important thing, and it was a good thing. It was long overdue, but it was good and it was right that we reject any form of anti-Semitism and that we recognize that there were some people who were responsible for Jesus' death. It was not the whole nation, but rather the leaders of the nation. And then the crucifixion of Jesus, beginning in verse 26. As they led Jesus away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Jesus is led away to be crucified. Now, normally the pictures that we see of Jesus carrying a cross are like the one on the screen in front of you, that silhouette. But that's not how it was done. That's historically inaccurate. The only piece that the person being crucified had to carry was the cross piece, the horizontal piece. The vertical pieces that were placed in the ground were already at the site of crucifixion. Those crosses would have been incredibly heavy and much too heavy for any one individual to carry, especially after one had been flogged. And so the cross piece was the only piece that was carried, and in this instance, Jesus was so flogged and so weak that Simon of Cyrene was recruited, and Simon of Cyrene carried the cross, carried that cross piece for Jesus. A great number of people followed, and people that Luke labels the daughters of Jerusalem, and they are weeping and they are beating their breasts. And Jesus speaks to them. "Daughters of Jerusalem," he calls. "Blessed are those who are barren. Blessed are those who are not nursing." Jesus here is talking about a tragedy that is going to happen a number of years after he has been crucified. In 66 AD, a revolt is going to begin against the Romans. It's the first Jewish revolt, and it will last from 66 AD to 73 AD. And during that time, in 70 AD, Rome will come in and once again destroy Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and destroy people. What Jesus is saying here is that it's better to not have children that you have to carry, not to have children that you have to nurse, but when you are fleeing the Romans, it would be better if the hills fell on you and the mountains fell on you than to be caught by the Romans and publicly tortured and publicly humiliated, which Rome was excellent at doing. Rome will crush Jerusalem in 70 AD. It will be a reign of terror. The picture you see in front of you now is the mountain fortress called Masada. And in 70 AD, many of the Jews fled Jerusalem, and they fled to the top of that mountain, and they stayed there for 3 years. Rome proceeded to follow them, and it took them 3 years to build a ramp up to the top of Masada. And they were going to capture those people, men, women, and children. They were going to imprison them. They were going to torture them. They were going to turn them into slaves. And 900 people decided that it would be better to jump off that mountain, to jump off Masada and die by suicide than it would be to be captured by the Romans and tortured. And then Jesus says, "If they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry. It is perhaps a way of saying, if Rome puts one Jew to death when there is no rebellion, what will they do when the rebellion finally comes? And we know what they did, and it was horrible. 2 others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with Jesus. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on the right and one on his left. And then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself if he is the Messiah, God's chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him, This is the King of the Jews. One of the criminals who were hanged with him kept deriding him, saying, Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And then he said to Jesus, Remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus replied, Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. So Jesus is taken to a place of crucifixion called the place of the skull because it's a large rock and it looks like a skull. And if you were to go to Jerusalem today and visit there, you can go to that place of the skull. It looks like a skull. There's a garden tomb next to it. And whether or not that's the actual place where Jesus was crucified, we don't know. There's a much older site, but that older site, it's very hard to imagine that this is the place where Jesus was crucified because the older site is actually inside of a church. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre has been built over that site, and so it's hard to get your imagination around that. The place of the skull in Greek is cranion, which of course we get the word cranium from. In Matthew and Mark, it's called Golgotha, which is Aramaic also for the place of the skull. Now Jesus speaks the first word from the cross. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Each gospel writer offers us different words for what Jesus said from the cross. We oftentimes talk about the 7 last words of Christ. And maybe you've been in a congregation that during the Lenten season, each Wednesday night has taken a look at one of those words. There are 7 of them. 3 of them are in the Gospel of Luke. 3 of them are in the Gospel of John. And 1 is in the Gospel of Matthew and repeated in the Gospel of Mark. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. Then we are told that the Roman soldiers cast lots for Jesus' clothes, and that can either mean they were throwing dice or they were doing long straw, short straw. The leaders scoff, If you are the Messiah, save yourself. He's mocked, and one of the criminals speaks to Jesus, and he also mocks him. If you are the Messiah, then save yourself and save us too. But the second criminal counters that. And he says, there's justification for our crucifixion because of what we have done. But this man has done nothing wrong. And then he turns to Jesus and says, Remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus speaks the second word from the cross in the Gospel of Luke. Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Now what's interesting about this sentence, it can be said in one of 2 ways. We want to remember that there was no punctuation back when the New Testament was written. In fact, punctuation didn't even come in until about the 15th century. So it depends on where you put the comma, how you want to interpret Jesus saying. The typical way of interpreting it is just like I read it. Truly I tell you, comma, today you will be with me in paradise. But if you move the comma just one word, it changes the whole meaning. Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. In the first rendering, it's the present. In the second rendering, it is the future. And you can take your choice which one you prefer. And then we have, lastly, the death of Jesus. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. We are told that from noon until 3 o'clock, darkness came over the whole land. The light failed. It is a reminder to us that in Jesus' death, not only does Jesus save, not only does Jesus redeem you and me, but the entire creation is broken. The entire creation has been impacted by sin. And when Jesus dies on the cross, he dies for all of created life. The Apostle Paul reminds us of this in the 8th chapter of Romans when he says that all of creation groans in travail until the redemption. All of creation is broken, all of creation is served. All of creation is broken, all of creation is saved. And then we are told that the temple curtain is torn in two. That curtain was huge, and it was in the center of the temple, in the Holy of Holies, and it separated the outer court from the inner court, and in that inner court, the only person allowed in there, the only person who could pass through that heavy curtain was the high priest. And he did that only once a year on the Day of Atonement when he went into the Holy of Holies to sacrifice for God's people. That temple is torn in two, which perhaps is a way of saying that in the death of Jesus, we now all have access to God. Or it may be saying that in the death of Jesus, God now has access to all of creation. Or it may be saying that if you really want to understand who God is, if we really want to know this God of God, this King of Kings, this Lord of Lords, this God of all creation, the closest we can ever come to knowing God's true self is in the very heart of God, in the suffering of his Son, Jesus Christ. And so then the temple is torn. We understand who God really is, the passion of God for the sake of the world. And then Jesus' third and final word, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," which is a quote from Psalm 31. And it's a reminder to us that Jesus oftentimes prayed the Psalms. Jesus then dies, really dies. There was a book written years and years ago called The Passover Plot, which claimed that Jesus didn't really die, but that he was taken down from the cross, hidden away in a cave till his wounds were healed, and that he came back. But that's certainly not the witness of the New Testament. And then a centurion speaks. Certainly this man was innocent. The crowds beat their breasts. They go home. Some of the women stand by, continuing to watch. Now there's more to this story, because after the death of Jesus, there's the burial of Jesus, and then, of course, the resurrection of Jesus. But we'll get to the resurrection next week. So, read this text, Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 49. I really encourage you to read it before Sunday, read it several times, and then ask yourself the question, if I were preaching this Sunday, what's the central theme that I would want to convey? What's the very heart of this gospel story that I would want people to know? Because that's really what Pastor Mark is doing this week as he prepares to preach this Sunday morning. And so our task is also to prepare by reading the text, by reflecting on the text, and by praying for our pastor so that God's good word can come through his voice. Thanks again for being with us today. Look forward to seeing you next week when we talk about the resurrection of Jesus our Lord.